Good evening, and welcome to this episode of Kelly's Corner. I think I mentioned in the last episode that this week holds many historical dates that are of interest to me. And so I thought I would cover some of those, give some interesting backstory, some fun tidbits, just things of interest as far as that goes. Along with the history of this week. As far as history goes, this particular week in April is one of my very favorite weeks of the entire year. Probably second only to the week in November that surrounds the Kennedy assassination. So I thought we could dive into some history. We'll cover a little bit of everything, I guess. Cover some of the Civil War. We'll talk about presidents. We'll talk about some ships. We'll just dive into some interesting tidbits and facts that occurred at various points in history this week. So let's jump right on in here. Today is April the 10th, 2025. And that means that yesterday, April the 9th, was the 160th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. The Civil War ended, at least for all intents and purposes, on April the 9th of 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse at the McLean House, there in Appomattox Courthouse. The formal declaration of war, however, is a little more complicated. The war did end, at least in Northern Virginia, in April of 1865, when Lee surrendered. But it took a little bit of time to get word out that Lee had surrendered, and for negotiations to take place and for hostages to be transferred and this, that, and the other. So the formal declaration of the end of the war did not occur until August the 20th of 1866. Some, I guess, 18-ish months later. But the generally accepted date of the end of the Civil War was April the 9th of 1865, 160 years ago. Interesting to note, there was a man, his name was Wilmer McLean, and he lived, in 1861 anyway, he lived in the town of Manassas, Virginia. And in 1861, there in Manassas, one of the very first battles of the Civil War took place. And it just so happened to involve his home. And after the Battle of Manassas, or otherwise known as Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run, first Battle of Manassas, he decided that he was going to move his family to Appomattox, Virginia, to escape the war, because he felt like living in Appomattox, Virginia would be a little safer. It would be a little farther from the fighting. But instead, his home there in Appomattox just so happened to be the place that Lee surrendered. And so he holds the distinction of having his home be involved in the very first, or one of the very first, I guess the first major battle, but one of the first, and the very last major battle in the Civil War. And his name is Wilmer McLean. If we jump ahead 2 days, after Lee surrendered, everybody pretty much realized that the war was over. There were celebrations, especially in Washington City. And then on April the 11th of 1865, President Abraham Lincoln gave what was going to be, or what ended up being, I guess, his final speech. And the tone of his speech was very much reconciliation with the South, bringing the South back together into the fold of the Union, becoming one country again, to reconcile their differences. John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor at the time, and we'll find out in a few minutes, he became a little bit more. But John Wilkes Booth was a very famous actor. He was from the Booth family, who was a famous family of actors. He was in the audience when President Lincoln gave his speech there on April 11th of 1865. In fact, if you look at the picture of that speech, many say that you can actually see John Wilkes Booth in the crowd. But he was in the audience, and it was during that speech that Mr. Booth, who was keeping a secret to himself and a very few select other people, made a decision. The secret that he was keeping was that he had been planning for some time a kidnapping plot. He had planned to kidnap the president and hold him for ransom. He was a Southern sympathizer, and he believed that all the South needed was a little bit of boost, and they would rise again and end up defeating the North. But it was during that speech that he switched his plot from a kidnapping plot to he decided that he was going to murder President Abraham Lincoln. In fact, after that speech, he was quoted of saying that that is the last speech that he will ever give. And that ended up being the case. It ended up being the very last speech that Abraham Lincoln ever gave. In the days leading up to his assassination, President Lincoln had at least one premonition of his assassination. He had a dream, and in the dream he woke up and could hear sobbing, and so he followed the sobs. And he ended up in the East Room of the White House, and there was a catafalque, and there were people standing guard over the catafalque and weeping and crying. And he asked one of the guards there, who had passed away, and the guard said, "Well, the president, he was shot by an assassin," and that ended up being a very eerie premonition, because on Good Friday, April the 14th of 1865, that's exactly what John Wilkes Booth did there at Ford's Theater in Washington. President Lincoln was attending the play Our American Cousin, with Laura Keene as the leading lady. And he arrived at the theater and was greeted to thunderous applause. In fact, they actually stopped the play. He was a little bit late, and they stopped the play when he arrived so that he could get to the presidential booth. And as he walked in, the whole crowd erupted into applause, and they gave him a standing ovation. And the band there at the play actually played Hail to the Chief as he walked in. And they go into the presidential booth, the presidential box there at Ford's Theater, to sit and enjoy the rest of the play. It was him and his wife and a couple that had been invited by Miss Lincoln, Miss Harris, and Major Henry Rathbone, which is their story is a little bit interesting in its own right. We won't get into that today, but maybe another episode we can dive into that. But they were the Lincoln's guests that evening, and at one point during the play, Mary Todd Lincoln leaned over and asked the president, "What will Miss Harris think of me holding on to you so?" And Lincoln replied that she wouldn't think anything about it, and that is widely considered to be the very last things that he said, was that she wouldn't think anything about it. Booth, being an actor, knew the play well, and he knew that there was going to be a line that was going to get thunderous applause and laughter. And that particular line he felt would be the appropriate time to shoot the president. And so when Mr. Hawk, one of the actors, uttered the words, "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, you old..." sockdologizing old man trap. Booth entered the president's box, lifted his single-shot Derringer, and shot Lincoln at around 10:15. The bullet entered the back of the president's head, just behind his left eye. It shattered both orbital sockets, and the president was immediately unconscious. As you can imagine, fear struck not only the presidential box, but the entire theater. People screaming. Booth jumps out of the box, lands on the stage, breaking his leg in the process, and as he's running off the stage, utters the words "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus only to tyrants." Gets away, and one of the largest manhunts in American history unfolds. President Lincoln is carried across the street to the Peterson home, and he is laid in a borrowed room because they felt that the trip to the White House would be enough to kill him almost instantly. So they took him across the street, laid him diagonal across the bed because his 6'4" frame was too large to fit on the bed completely, so they laid him diagonally. And he lay there, never regaining consciousness. And the next morning, April the 15th, 1865, at 7:22 a.m., he passed away. When he passes away, Andrew Johnson effectively becomes the 17th president. It is interesting to note that the plot that Booth waged against Lincoln also included some of his conspirators. One of his conspirators was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson, but that did not happen. George Atzerodt, I believe, was the one given charge to kill him, and he actually chickened out and got drunk instead. So interesting to note. So he becomes president, and ironically enough, the Reconstruction of the South was much more harsh on the South under Johnson's presidency than it ever would have thought about being under Lincoln's, which kind of defeated what Booth had believed to be the case. Booth thought that Lincoln was the enemy of the South, and in reality, or as it turned out, Johnson, who was actually from the South himself, ended up being worse on the South than Lincoln would have been. But John Wilkes Booth would be caught and would die 12 days later from a gunshot wound that he sustained during his capture. It's also interesting to note that along with Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln, William Seward was supposed to be assassinated in this plot as well. And the person, Lewis Payne, I believe, was supposed to assassinate him. And he actually did attempt to go through with the assassination. He made it into William Seward's home, made it into William Seward's bedroom, and actually did stab and wound William Seward and his son, Frederick. He wounded him very, very badly, but William Seward had been incapacitated with an injury and had a neck brace, and the neck brace managed to save his life. It managed to keep some of the wounds that he sustained to a minimum. As he was being stabbed, it deflected some of the wounds that he incurred, which ended up effectively saving his life. So switching gears a little bit, I guess. Still discussing presidents, however. On April the 12th of this year, 2025, will be the 80th anniversary of when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, died. He passed away on April the 12th of 1945, right at a month before World War II ended. But he died in Warm Springs, Georgia, of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was sitting posing for a painting, a portrait that had been commissioned, and he was sitting there and reached his hand up to his head and said, "I have a terrific headache." And as he uttered that, he slumped over in his wheelchair. He was taken to his bedroom. The doctors were called, but there was at that point nothing that could be done to save the president, and he was pronounced dead at 3:35 p.m. that day. He was actually in Warm Springs. Eleanor Roosevelt was in Washington, D.C., so she was actually there when they were not together when he passed away. And she gets called back to the White House and informed that he had died. And then they got Vice President Truman, who had been literally vice president only a couple of months, and was so new to the vice presidency that he had not even been trusted with the details of the Manhattan Project, which was the project of the dropping of the atomic bomb. And so he gets called to the White House, and there he meets Eleanor Roosevelt and is informed that the president has died, and he is now president effectively. And he looks at Miss Roosevelt and he asks her, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And her response is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now. And he probably, not knowing the magnitude of the Manhattan Project or anything like that, may not have even realized what she meant. But he very quickly learned. And he was the one that had to make the decision a couple of months later to drop the atomic bomb, whether or not to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would end World War II. So we got that this week. And then switching gears almost completely, we'll go back to the year of 1912. April of 1912, 113 years ago. 113 years ago today, actually, April the 10th, 1912. The Titanic, who's captained by Edward Smith, on his final voyage before retiring, ironically enough, set sail from Southampton on its maiden voyage. So you got Edward Smith, who's on his final voyage before retiring, and then the Titanic, who's on its maiden voyage, his very first voyage. The Titanic had been said to be completely unsinkable, that, quote, even God himself could not sink this ship. Well, as we know, that didn't fare so well for the Titanic. You don't say that kind of stuff. There were 920 people that boarded the Titanic in Southampton, and as it was leaving Southampton, it very narrowly avoided disaster out of the gate, as it almost collided with the SS City of New York. And that actually delayed the leaving of Titanic for about an hour while the City of New York ship regained control of itself and was gotten out of the way, but they almost collided before it even left, and would have actually probably been better off having had that happen there than what ended up happening just a few short days later. But they ported, docked at a couple of cities, picking up other passengers and letting some passengers get off, and then they began their journey across the North Atlantic to New York City, where they were going to dock a few days later. But on April the 14th of 1912, at 11:40, around about the ship's time, one of the lookouts, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg, quote, right ahead. And he notified the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship to steer around the iceberg and for the engines to be put in reverse. But unfortunately, it was too late, and the Titanic struck the iceberg on the starboard side, and it made a series of holes below the waterline. As a result of that, 5 of 16 watertight compartments were breached. That's significant because Titanic can remain afloat, or could remain afloat, with the first 4 watertight compartments breached. But 5 were breached, which meant that Titanic would ultimately sink. There were only enough lifeboats on Titanic to fit about half of those on board. And in the icy North Atlantic, that's a big deal, because you can't last very long in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. And of those boats, lifeboats that were on board, they were only filled, each of them, at the very maximum, to an average of about 60%, because they weren't sure if they would buckle with the weight of the people. There was an issue with the crew not being versed in how to use the lifeboats, because they hadn't really had practice on them. So the evacuation of the ship was not a good situation to start with, much less in the middle of an emergency. And so they had women and children first on the lifeboats to get them off, and Titanic sinks below the surface of the North Atlantic around 2:20 a.m. on April the 15th of 1912, which, ironically enough, it struck the iceberg on April the 14th, which was the day Abraham Lincoln was shot, and it sank on April the 15th, which was the day Abraham Lincoln died. The icy waters of the North Atlantic were frigid, to say the very least. They had a temperature that night of around 28 degrees. There's a couple of Titanic museums. One is in Pigeon Forge, and I believe there's one in Branson, Missouri. If you've ever been to either of those museums, they have an exhibit there at both of them, where you can actually stick your hand in water that is the temperature of 28 degrees. It is set to that, to see how long you can leave your hand in the water. I've done it a couple of times, and my hand doesn't last more than about 5 seconds before it starts to tingle and feels like knives are stabbing me. It is very uncomfortable. But the people who were not fortunate enough to get in the lifeboat, most of them ended up in the water. Those that were able to get off the boat, it is said that some third-class passengers were locked below to keep them from getting to the lifeboats before the first and second class. But those that managed to get in the water were forced to brave extremely icy dangerous conditions where you could only last a few minutes at the most before freezing to death. Only 5 people in the water survived long enough to be helped into a lifeboat. Only 5. And very few lifeboats even went back for survivors just to see if they could rescue anyone. The lifeboats, sad to say, but the lifeboats that were there that had been launched from the Titanic before it sank had room for approximately 500 people outside of the people that were already in the lifeboats. But only 5 people were pulled on board. So there were room on those lifeboats for 495 more people that either drowned or froze to death. After the Titanic hit the iceberg, the wireless operators radioed for help for nearby ships. And the closest one that responded was the Carpathia, the RMS Carpathia. And it arrived around 4 a.m., a little more than an hour and a half after the Titanic sank, to pick up the survivors. And by that time, the only survivors there were the ones in the lifeboats. There were 706 people saved that night. 1,517 people approximately died in the Titanic disaster. There were several investigations that were held both in the United States and in Britain to find out what went wrong and what they could do better. And some things that came out of it was that there has to be enough lifeboats on a ship for every single person on board. That wasn't the case the night of the Titanic. So one of the legacies of the Titanic is that now, going forward from 1912, every person on a ship will have a spot on a lifeboat, just in case the unthinkable happens. Something else that happened because of the Titanic, there's an international ice patrol that guards the waters all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The International Ice Patrol is at work, letting people know where there are icebergs, and so that disasters like this hopefully won't happen again. And one of the issues that the Titanic ran into was that one of the closest ship to the Titanic the night it sank, that probably could have made it in time, the radio operator had turned his radio off and gone to bed. And so because of the Titanic disaster, radio communications on ships have to be kept open 24 hours a day, every day that they're on the water. The Titanic carried a lot of famous people. In fact, it was that kind of a who's who of Titanic. You had John Jacob Astor IV. He was a real estate tycoon. You had Molly Brown, who was named the unsinkable Molly Brown. You had Ida and Isidore Straus, famous founder of Macy's. In fact, Ida had a spot on the lifeboat. She had a spot on a lifeboat. She could have saved herself, but she would not leave her husband. She refused. Her husband was actually offered a spot, and he said that he would not board a lifeboat before the other men, even knowing what not boarding a lifeboat would mean. But she said she would not leave her husband, and so they died together in the Titanic disaster. John Jacob Astor, he died as well. Molly Brown was saved in the disaster. You have Benjamin Guggenheim, another famous person. And you have Archibald Butt. He was a friend and a military aide to President William Howard Taft. And when President Taft got word that his friend, Archibald Butt, had died in the Titanic disaster, he was overcome with grief over the loss of his friend. There were several people, well-known people, famous people, that had tickets to Titanic for the maiden voyage, because I mean this was the ship. This was something you wanted to do, but at the last minute, ultimately decided against going, or for one reason or another. People like Milton Hershey, who of Hershey, the Hershey Company, and then J.P. Morgan, and people like J.P. Morgan backing out of going on the boat, and then what ultimately ended up happening has led to, in recent years, conspiracy theories about whether or not it was really Titanic that sank, or if it was one of her sister ships and they were just trying to pull over some kind of insurance fraud scheme. I can buy into some conspiracy theories, but Titanic is not one of them that I believe happened. I mean, I guess it very well could be that it was one of the sister ships, but I tend to believe and err on the side that Titanic was the ship that sank in April of 1912. But again, my opinion, completely. If you want to share your opinion with me, I'd love to read about it in the comments. And if there's something, that I don't cover that you want to hear me cover, leave that in the comments as well. I'd love to, research something you want to know about, and be able to tell you about it, discuss it in a later episode of a podcast. But again, it's my opinion, only my opinions, based completely on my opinion, research and things that I've done to formulate those opinions. But anyway, we've covered a lot of history. A lot of interesting stuff happened in this week of April. Not really sure what the next podcast will be, but I'll find something of interest and we'll dig into that, even if it's just about life, an update on life. It's been an interesting week for me. In fact, I may do another episode later in the week, or this weekend, encompassing this past week. It's been kind of a difficult week, but that's another story for another day. But I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Gone a little longer. I think this might be the longest episode I've done, but that's all right. We've covered a lot of history and a lot of interesting things. But I'm going to sign off now. I hope everyone has a great night and a wonderful day whenever it is that you listen. And I will catch you next time. See ya.